Good morning and welcome to Behind the Screen. I'm JM, and this is a show where we talk about gaming, game design, campaign planning, adventure design, and we're continuing on a series about uh, exploring science fiction. We're in the middle of space opera, and we've got science fantasy left, and that's going to kind of wrap us up on our journey through science fiction. Some people have requested a horror one, and I think I can do the horror one in three parts, but not a story in three parts. I'm looking right at you, Rothfuss. Or a silence of three parts. Is that how his story started? Just anyway. So we talked last time about the space opera genre. What are the sources? What are our influences? And mechanically, what do we want to see in a game that has to do with space opera? And I think the first thing that we need to do is we want to see heroes that are resilient, right? In near science fiction and cyberpunk, our characters can be gunned down in the street. It reinforces the violence. In near science fiction, one bad airlock roll and our story is over. But in space opera, you want the heroes to be sort of larger than life. In space opera, the characters are most often those exceptional people that the story revolves around. So one thing I think you want to look at is you want to make sure you have resilient people. Currently designing maybe not a space opera, but it has some space opera-esque tones to it. Sci-fi game with Ben, who plays in the Tor game and in the Space 1889 game. And one of the things we do is we have sort of a buffer, much like in Jackals, where Jackals has valor, heroes have guts. And as long as your guts is high, you don't have to worry about taking incidental damage. So we want our heroes to feel at the center of the story. We want them to feel larger than life. And so that means starting off competently. And I'm sort of looking at Traveler here. Traveler can feel like, how did I get through my life? And this is the level of competence I'm at. But I think Traveler has its own sort of unique feel to it. Modern Traveler does a little bit better job of that. We should have Gabe on here. Gabe has some very strong feelings about Mongoose Traveler versus T5 and what Mark is really trying to do with Traveler 5. So I may have to have him on behind the screen to just talk about that. So other things that we want is we want power and options in the hands of our players. Not in the same way that we have kind of the gun chasing that we would see in Cyberpunk. But we want our characters to feel like their pieces of gear are special and that they're powerful. So, money rarely factors into space opera. You want the characters to have access to all of the tools so that they can then just enjoy the results of that. So mechanically, what I mean by that is we want the characters to have lots of options. Options to distinguish themselves, and not just options to distinguish one shooter from another or one pilot from another. We want characters to have options in the ways of customizing their spaceships, their fighters, making it personal. Space opera, despite being set on a broad tableau of planets and intrigue and empires and cults and all of this, we want the characters to feel like the story is about them and matters to them, which is when we were talking about 40K, when I said the roots are in space opera, that's really kind of the thing that I would say tends not to be the case in 40K. You are one Space Marine among the Legion. You are one Inquisitor among hundreds of thousands. You are one Imperial Guard among billions. We don't want that feeling necessarily in space opera. And I realize we're getting a little bit into the experience, but this kind of ties in mechanically. We also want an array of cool abilities for our individual players. So things like psionics, multiple talents of psionics, different esoteric fighting styles, whether it's gunslinging or sniping or fencing, knife fighting. We want all of that as an options for our players, as well as options for different alien species, not just to find, fight, or encounter, but also to play. So I'm going to hold up as an exemplar here Infinity, the Infinity role-playing game. A lot of different species you can play, especially with the TOA and the Combined Army. Although I have to go and look at the Combined Army and see how many you actually get to play. But you have a ton of options. What sphere are you from? A lot of different choices of life paths. The gear is there. The strangeness, the hacking rules. We want another thing is, if this is the style of space opera you're playing, you want to have good rules for technology. Can players hack? If they can, what can they hack? Can players create items? If they can, what items can they create? If there is a strange plot MacGuffin, how are the players going to solve it? And I think of Red Shirts. Is it John Scalzi who did Red Shirts? Where they have literally the box that they put all of the plot puzzle pieces into, and an hour later it creates the thing that they need to solve the issue. That is a feeling of space opera. It gives the, because remember, if we're mapping our fantasy and our science fiction, space opera and high fantasy go hand in hand. The big vistas, the strange locations, lots of different types of magic or science that pushes the edge right to any highly advanced science is indistinguishable from magic. Think of Star Trek. Some of the things that they do, although they are couched in physics or pseudoscience, are frankly magical. The replicator, in and of itself, transporter. Do we get into the debate of whether you die while being transported? I don't know. Bob and I have talked about that. Yes, Calvin. Calvin is always plays an amazing hacker in our games, whether it's Infinity, Shadowrun. If the game has rules for infiltrating data systems, our friend Calvin, that's usually the character he gravitates to. Good morning, John Doom. Good to see you. So, the other thing that I think really is necessary mechanically, John is on the side of death during transport, and there is a great, if I can find it, I will link it into the show notes. It's my show. I can digress anytime I want. There's this great short called The 1 Minute Time Machine. Don't know if you guys have seen that. But a guy is trying to pick up a girl in a park, and he has a time machine that lets him go back 1 minute. And without spoiling too much, it definitely plays into the transporter theory when you get to that. It is fantastic, John Doom. Thank you. I will link it in the show notes. So, Padre, you know what? Depending on your flavor of science fiction and space opera, that may not even be a question that is asked. I think for me, that's one of the questions that's very interesting in Hamilton's Commonwealth Saga, is when you upload, what actually remains of the person? Right now, I read a white paper, I think, on whole brain emulation. But the only way they could figure out how to do it in this paper was what is called destructive whole brain emulation, where they would basically take slices of the brain, very thin, scan them, recomposite them in a matrix. Well, at that point, is it me that lives on? I don't think so. I think it is the most Gnostic version of myself, which I don't want to meet in any way, shape, or form. But we don't necessarily deal with those in space opera. The other thing I think that would be interesting is, do we talking about character resilience, talking about the high level of technology, does death enter into the story mechanically? There are games that allow you to ignore death, whether it's because of brain emulation, digital backups, cloning, um, mind pairing. I mean, we see all of this, right? Think about, let's go back to Star Trek. Star Trek 3, well, not the greatest Star Trek movie, deals with, in sort of scientific and pseudoscientific terms, the resurrection of a dead character. And it had Christopher Lloyd as a Klingon, which, I don't know, I thoroughly enjoy that. So let's see here. Padres Weber addresses this in Off Armageddon's Reef. Yes, Merlin wrestles with the fact of who they are. Are they the young uh, naval officer who had the android body for her recreation, or is she now Merlin, the man who is trying to shape Safehold? These are great questions to ask in space opera. I think more often we'll find those in near science fiction, Philip K. Dick style stories, but I do enjoy these sort of philosophical roots in science fiction. If you get far enough, John, in the Commonwealth saga, into the Dreaming trilogy, and then into the final duology, there are people wrestling with this. Is it easier to try and hold all of these thousands of years of memory, or is it easier to just shunt off the portions you don't want into a data space and basically bifurcate who you are? What does that do to you? What does that do to the way you perceive the world? Great stuff. John Doom, are you playing space opera? I know Peg is hard at work at creating a sci-fi companion. Oh, yeah, I am. I cannot wait. I backed the horror companion. I've got the fantasy companion coming in. The Savage Worlds companion series are up there with me in my mind as the old generic genre books from GURPS 3rd edition, where you would just buy them because they were a great reference tool. So yeah, Borderlands, Bob, where you kind of get, re-sleeved and kind of put back in into the game. I love when that happens. All right, final thing I think we actually kind of need to talk about mechanically that you would want in a robust science fiction or science space opera game are exploration rules. You need to know what the different lay of the land is. You need to know how you get through the land. Are you charting subsectors and discovering what is in there as in Traveler? Are you going to different worlds as outlined in the Infinity game and discovering what is going on? I think these are important because they add the sense of the vastness of the universe, which is something we expect to see in science fiction and space opera games. Even take Star Wars, which we're going to delve more into in our look at science fantasy, but astrogation and hyperdrives are a big part, and hyperdrive accidents are a big part of most of the Star Wars games that I have played. Oh man, are we talking about Hyperion? So Hyperion and Fall of Hyperion would also be good space opera stories, if that's the Hyperion you're referring to, Rook, because, oh, no, you're talking about Borderlands. Haha, I put it together. But yeah, Dan Simmons' Hyperion has a lot of space opera elements to it. The Hyperion Cantos as opposed to the Hyperion Corporation. So the other thing I think you want, and most people would refer to these as narrative structures, and we'll talk about this more in the experience, but I personally like having rules in a space opera game for social networks. And I'm looking right at you, Infinity, the role-playing game. You did a great job with your social network rule. And here's why. so much of space opera also revolves around the political, the military, the corporate, the commercial aspects of vast regions of space, vast commonwealths of humanity. Again, I'm thinking of the Peter Hamilton series, because when we get that far into the future, when we get that spread out, we also want to know how we still can relate to each other. And so having rules for how to influence organizations, how to unravel conspiracies, how to set people at war with each other. These are mechanics that we're going to want to see against the backdrop of our space opera. So mass combat rules are another great way to have a mechanical reference point for the vastness of things that are going on. Speaking of mass combat rules, I know a lot of people, there's sort of a spectrum, if you will. There's the Adventurer Conqueror King, which I love, where we're gonna throw down army tiles on the board, and you're gonna have your characters can go out there and have moments of exceptionalism. And then all the way through the abstracted, which L5R I think did brilliantly, where each round of mass combat you chose how deeply engaged you were in the fight, and you could only move, I think, one range band each round, heavily engaged to reserves. And then you rolled on a table to see what sort of encounter you had in that round of combat. I don't think it matters which one you have in your space opera game, but I think you need one, because inevitably that backdrop of vast planets and kingdoms and networks of jump gates and corporations, things are eventually going to start to break down. There was a great book on the origins of war and the preservation of peace. I know Matt Colville has talked about this, and he boiled it down to, and I think this is brilliant, don't ask why people are going to war. Ask why your people are at peace right now. Because human nature being what it is, war seems to be our default state. So, yeah, John, I enjoy jump gates a lot. And I think that comes from some of the first science fiction gaming I ever did was BattleTech. And I love their jump gate, well, maybe not jump gate, jump point, I should say, map of the inner sphere. But take BattleTech, for example. The whole point of BattleTech is that humanity is not evolved past its baser instincts and its desire for war. When we first get exposed to Star Wars, we're in the middle of a rebellion. Pandora Star very quickly breaks out into a war. Sorry, John, a little bit of a spoiler. Right? Even in our near future, we have things like Marines because humanity is what it is. Star Trek postulates a future of peace, which I love. But inevitably, the Federation comes into conflict with other empires and kingdoms and species. Even the Orville, which I don't know why I haven't mentioned until now. The Orville ends up building towards a pretty massive war story at the end of season 2 and the aftermath of that in season 3. War is a continuation of politics by other means, yes. And it's not Klein who wrote on the origins of war. He points out that there have been more years of warfare somewhere on the planet than there have ever been of peace. And if there is peace in your setting, it is because somebody or a group of somebodies are tirelessly working to preserve it. And as soon as they go away, everything tumbles back into chaos. So we're going to wrap up on Thursday with the end of this exploring space opera. We're going to talk about the experience, which will have a little bit of overlap today, but I enjoy our conversations on this. We're talking about what would bring to the table this feeling of space opera. We'll talk about that. It's going to be a lot of fun. And then next week, we're going to get into our view of science fantasy. We're going to talk about Starfinder. We're going to talk about Star Wars and a couple of other ones. But tonight, we're going to be starting our launch day adventure with the characters that we made last week for Space 1889. Got some great art from Mr. Bob Crumb. Thank you. Yes, Fading Suns as well, Rook. War is on the horizon, right? Lost Worlds, you have the tension between the Empire and the Voldrox. Or not the Voldrox. Oh yeah, the Barbarians. The Voldrox Barbarians. So yeah, there is you have the factions barely held together by the Pax Alexi. These are great ways of showing that off. And so we're going to talk about Fading Suns next week, or Thursday, a little bit more, I think. So tonight we've got our Space 1889. Kickstarter's going well. If we haven't already crossed the threshold for our second stretch goal, we are only like $40 away. That is by Strange Owl Games. They have funded, they've unlocked the order cards, which will be being previewed. Mr. Bob Crumb is working on that. And Tim Brown's adventure will be unlocked here shortly. They got a ton more great stretch goals coming up. I expect to be making posts on that later today, hopefully. John, thank you. It's been a lot of fun. I will just say maybe we'll do a debrief after the Kickstarter close on all the lessons learned while running a Kickstarter. It's a good thing that I have the haircut that I do. Otherwise, it all would have fallen out from stress. So until next time, stay safe, stay healthy, stay gaming. It's always good to talk with all of you. Thank you for tuning in on this episode of Behind the Screen. We'll see you soon. And before I forget, John, we are looking at doing a sequel to our Rifts game, either in December or January. So expect info shortly. Till then, we'll see you all later. I'll see you tonight either on Space 1889 or Thursday for more Behind the Screen. Have a good one.